This is Garis Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 627, entitled Government Measures to Force Both Sexes to Reproduce to Prevent Extinction. Description. Sooner or later, governments will be forced to address the population crash issue by menfairing the gender laws, reforming the divorce courts, creating GECs, that's gender equality committees in the parliaments, by FIPping women, pushing the MCT, that's Mother Career Timeline, onto women, creating baby farms, etc., to bring the birth rate up to the replacement rate, or we wipe ourselves out. This flyer suggests a string of measures that governments can use to increase the plummeting birth rate. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, now has a birth rate of 0.59 children per woman, the worst in the world, which obviously cannot continue if we are not to go extinct. The flyer itself. Government measures to force both sexes to reproduce to prevent extinction, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Some years ago, I attended a public lecture at my local university, that's Melbourne University, given by a female New York Times journalist on climate change. In question time, I suggested to her that a solution to the climate change problem would be to allow the feminist to keep control of the divorce courts so that divorce would remain toxic to men, so that young men would continue to reject marriage and paternity, thus crashing the birth rate, thus reducing the population to the point that the total planetary pollution load would go down enough for the Earth to be able to cope with it. The woman just stared at me with glazed eyes, in total incomprehension, not having enough intellectual hooks to begin to fathom what I had just told her. She was utterly clueless and merely asked for the next question in total cognitive rejection. That was a few years ago. Now, July 2023, a lot more people are becoming aware that the rejection of marriage and paternity by a sizable proportion of young men due to the influence of MGTOW and masculist ideas, in brackets, which lash out at the toxicity of the divorce courts taken over in the 70s by the fluffy feminists who see men as cash machines to be robbed and abused in favour of divorcing women, close brackets, is leading to a crash in the birth rate. The worst case of population crash is in Seoul, the capital of South Korea, whose birth rate, the last time I googled it, was 0.59 kids per woman, which is less than a third of the replacement rate of 2.1 kids per woman. So within a century, Seoul will have wiped itself out, the numbers show. Thus, logic says, sooner or later, governments will have to get involved with trying to push up the birth rate, or we literally wipe ourselves out. That is, we drive ourselves to extinction. This flyer gives suggestions to governments on how they can force both sexes to reproduce to prevent extinction. The basic premise in this flyer is that survival takes higher priority over democratic freedom. When push really comes to shove regarding the need to reproduce to avoid extinction, then I think most people would agree that survival takes top priority. So what can governments do to boost the birth rate? This flyer offers a string of suggestions, a lot of them connected with gender roles, both male and female. Common sense says that to tackle the crash in the birth rate problem, one first needs to understand its causes. Japan, for example, has had several population ministers who failed miserably in attempting to boost the Japanese birth rate, because they lack the imagination to ask young men why they refuse to be fathers. These ministers merely told young men to man up, which only resulted in young Japanese men giving these ministers the finger, and the Japanese birth rate continued to decline. I'll try to be rather systematic about why the birth rate is plummeting from the male and the female point of view. I'll begin with the male point of view. In many Western countries now, divorce is so toxic that 2/3 of young men refuse to marry and have kids, since they refuse to face a one chance in 4 of being butchered in the hated, fluffy feminist-dominated divorce court system. So reject marriage and paternity, thus crashing the birth rate, as mentioned at the beginning of this flyer when talking about the female New York Times journalist's total incomprehension of my masculist reasoning. So, one obvious suggestion to raise the birth rate, coming from the Masculists and the MGTOWs, is to make the hated divorce courts a lot less toxic. How to do that? By making fundamental reforms in divorce law, for example, by menfairing the gender laws, by, for example, throwing out alimony, making custody of kids joint by default, throwing out the halving of wealth and stuff, by accepting the general principle of financial independence of both divorcing parties, that is, the mother and the father, in the divorce courts, so that men do not get butchered in them at a rate of one father in 4. But applying the principle of financial independence of both parties in the divorce courts will only work if society has accepted and implemented the idea of the FIPping of women, that is, having created a FIPP society, that is, one in which both sexes are socialized and educated to be FIPPs, that's financially independent persons, by bothering to get a career-competent education at high school and college, so that especially young women can be FIPPs as adults and not expect fluffy style to parasite off the labour and money of a man, thus making her the hated enemy of the masculists. So the masculists are pushing for the establishment of GECs, GECs, gender equality committees, in the parliaments that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues and inequalities of both sexes are dealt with equally, which is far from being the case in today's monoconscious, gynocentric culture. The masculist half of these GECs will push for the FIPping of women, the creation of a FIPP society, the legislation of the PARA, that's paternity rejection right, the legislation of the OPTAB, OPTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births, to combat women's horrible paternity fraud, which occurs very roughly in 1/10 of pregnancies. In other words, the masculists are pushing hard for fundamental changes in the very structure of society, arguing that it was men who gave women science-based medicine, and hence a life expectancy of 85 years, and hence a career window of half a century. So women have a powerful moral duty to FIPP up, or be treated by the masculists as hated, manslaving, divorce-raping vermin, to be exterminated by being totally ignored, not even pumped and dumped, so that such fluffy, manslaving, divorce-raping vermin have their genes removed from the gene pool. Masculists have a hatred of such gender criminal women and aim to wipe them out. Since most men are FIPPs, we men have the power to force women to grow up, to FIPP up, to pull their financial weight by totally ignoring fluffies, forcing them to rot on the shelf, utterly rejected by, masculistic in brackets, men, both socially and sexually, forced into a slow, miserable death by being manless, hence loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at, utterly, hatefully rejected, and left to die. Millions of young men would like to be fathers, but that will not happen until the gender laws are men-faired, and that means that society will need to be socially engineered, fundamentally restructured, so that women are FIPPs and don't expect to butcher their ex-husbands in the divorce courts. FIPP women can afford to pay for themselves after a divorce, So when all women are FIPs due to enormous moral pressure coming from the Masculists, in brackets, who in time will be most men, as Masculist ideas spread across the planet the way feminist ideas have, close brackets, then divorce can be made far less toxic for men than it is now. Masculists see monoconscious feminist divorce court lawyers and judges as indirect genociders who are strongly hated for that, since it is these monoconscious feminists who are indirectly wiping out whole populations due to their having made divorce so toxic for men that they have caused 2/3 of young men to reject marriage and paternity, which is the direct cause of the population crash. So the Masculists need to push strongly their message to the planet that society needs to be FIPped, that a FIPP society needs to be created so that women are FIPs, so that divorce becomes much less toxic for men, so that millions of men are more prepared to be fathers again. Now, what about women? Feminism has been preaching female careerism for about 6 decades, since Betty Friedan came out with her book, The Feminine Mystique, which pushed for women to fulfill themselves with careers similar to their husbands, instead of dying of boredom as mindless housewives in mindless suburbia, with their 1 or 2 kids off to school and twiddling their thumbs, with lots of time on their hands and no real purpose in life, a soulless existence. Masculists have proposed the MCT, that's Mother Career Timeline, for women, which allows a woman to have the best of both worlds, that is, the joy of motherhood and the satisfaction and challenge of a lifelong, demanding career. In the case of an upper middle class, intelligent woman, the MCT would be as follows. She gets her master's at 23, works in her career competent profession for 5 years, marries in that time, has her first kid at 29, her second at 31. Then, when her second kid is off to kindergarten, when she is 35, she goes back to her career, thus not being a fluffy parasite on her husband. If women don't FIP up, then most men, masculisted men, will not have relationships with them, since most men will spit at fluffies, seeing them as manslaving, divorce-raping vermin to be killed off slowly by being totally ignored. Both masculists and feminists can push the MCT, telling women that it's possible to have the best of both worlds, motherhood and career, by adopting something similar to the suggestions in the masculist MCT model. Then there are measures that governments can use to increase the birth rate, for example, by using propaganda, putting moral pressure on both sexes to reproduce, labelling those who don't as life leechers, who selfishly profit from the sacrifices their parents made in raising them, but who don't do the same to the next generation. Governments can tax childless adults heavily and pay mothers a hefty maternity wage when they stay at home for the 6 years when their younger of 2 children is 4 years old or younger. Governments can keep increasing the size of the maternity wage until enough women choose to be mothers. Hungary today, for example, spends 5% of its GDP on measures to promote the number of births in that country. Even more drastic measures can be undertaken by governments, for example, the creation of baby farms, that is, paying professional baby factory mothers to have a string of babies that whole villages of mothers and, in quotes, volunteer fathers can raise. Mothers can be given artificial insemination from very smart fathers so that women can have their hypergamous instincts satisfied, knowing that the kid they are growing will have high intelligence, etc. Volunteer fathers can be given salaries by the government to work in these baby farm villages so that the children are provided with male role models so that they don't grow up in a gynocentric culture the way young boys do today in primary and secondary schools that are run almost totally by women. Governments can give these baby farm mothers increasingly higher salaries so that enough women choose to be baby farmers so that the population does not collapse. Baby farms will be paid for from the population's taxes. So in effect, everyone is paying for the raising of the next generation of the population so that the population does not die out. Governments can create an intellectual climate through propaganda in which parenting is considered a powerful civic duty, so that those adults who avoid being parents are looked upon as selfish criminals to be severely punished in terms of social rejection and by being heavily taxed in comparison with parenting adults. All the above measures will probably be necessary to prevent us from wiping ourselves out due to too low birth rates. It's only a question of time before governments will be forced to take measures to increase the birth rate, or there will be no more baby cries and the last of the adults will die off, leaving the planet to the animals. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man's Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 620 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. These flyers are available in text and video formats on the YouTube channel prof.dr.hugo de Garis, as well as on Minds, BitChute, Odyssey and MGTOW.tv. Ciao.